Adapted from a novel by Philip K. Dick, the incredible story of an alternate reality where the Axis have won the Second World War. This is Amazon Prime original series, Rufus Sewell and Alexa Davalos, Man in the High Castle. The Man in the High Castle is a great Phil Dickensian novel, but the series adds an incredible array of original narrative and original characters to it. Now, I don't have to tell you, anytime you do that, it is extraordinarily dangerous, especially when you're taking a novel by a famous writer that is famous in its own right, that to be able to capture that unique character of the novel overall without butchering it by including your own ideas and perceptions. I mean, this is the story of our era. The story of our era is major studio merges, buys out, takes over some other studio with an intellectual property, with a built-in fan base. They decide they're going to manufacture a whole bunch of new offshoots, new shows, new movies, new whatever based on said property. And they end up focusing on all their original characters and inventing new ones that are completely inconsistent with the canon of that universe. And then when the fans of the old don't like it, they scream and call them names based on ism archaeobia. This has been the pattern. Do it, wash, repeat. Buy a new one, do it, wash, repeat. This has been the cycle for the last several years of woke. Man in the High Castle, 2015 debut, is really on the cusp. It's on the cusp of when shows were still allowed to be good. I'm not trying to be snarky. The truth. Now in the era of woke, there is literally a checklist of things. There are protected classes that cannot be the villain. There are certain classes that must be the villain. There are certain characters are defined by things like their sexuality, not by their personality, their history, or their growth. That can only exist when it's wrapped up in your sex, your race, whatever. With Man in the High Castle, it is one of those shows that gets wokeified and ruined, but I say it gets there because it doesn't begin that way. There's a handful of shows that are pre-woke that are fabulous. There's a handful of shows that were on the air, in production, existed as a thing during the emergence of woke. And you can see how they allowed woke to creep in. They tried to get with the times. They tried to meet the checklist, and it ended up ruining property after property. But at the beginning, Man in the High Castle adds an entirely new dimension to the story. The novel by Philip K. Dick focuses almost exclusively on the Pacific states. The story is set on the West Coast, the Japanese rule. We hear about the Nazi Reich, but the novel is very short in comparison to the narrative we're going to need for a show. They give us all these new characters in the Reich. They give us a whole lot and it's an incredible ability. They add all of these characters and dimensions to the story, but it's done so well. We get real people that are deeply flawed, normal human beings that are also complex, complicated human beings who actually learn things, and we get plots that actually make consistent sense over time, and we see things develop in a consistent way. Unlike the stuff now, which is childish, written by children, and experiences no growth. They don't believe that anyone they have vilified as a villain can ever be redeemed, and their life focuses around their immediate, constant sense of invented victimhood. And so this is why things happen in major Marvel films, where characters go through their story arc and they learn and they mature. And then the opening of the next story, they're back to where they were, because in the long run, they never really learn and they never really mature. There's never really any development beyond, because the emotional and psychological children that are writing this garbage have no idea how to develop a character. So with Man in the High Castle, we get the complicated Obergruppenführer John Smith. We get the complicated trade minister and Minister Kido, Tagomi and Kido in the Pacific States. We get the character of Alexa Davalos playing Juliana Crane. The whole idea of the multiple universes, one reality where the Allies won the war, this reality that the show focuses around where the Axis won the war, how these things develop. But we get men from Japan who are questioning the methods or methodology of their empire, people where evil things are done by people, but they're not evil people. And to varying degrees, some of them are more righteous than others. It's a complicated world, a world of adults who've gone through adult problems, made adult decisions, and experienced growth that brought them to maturity. In the Reich, we get the story of Obergruppenführer John Smith and those around him. John Smith, American war veteran. When America capitulated, he ended up in the SS. He ends up working for the Nazis as a way to protect his family. But then, of course, he's pulled in. He rises through the ranks. At each time that he has to make a sacrifice to do something awful or sacrifice some part of his soul in order to keep things safe, he ends up rising up the ranks and more has to do more and more to retain safety and security for him and his loved ones. And so for 2 seasons of some of the best television of the last 20 years or so, we get the adaptation of The Man in the High Castle, which in the book revolved around a book that told the story of an alternate timeline. In this version, it is films that are coming in from nobody knows where. They're not being faked. They're from the other universe, and there's a whole variety of them. There's the secretive Man in the High Castle, who in this is not the writer of the book, but the collector of the films. Adolf Hitler is collecting the films out of fear over what this represents for his Reich, this alternate reality. What does it all mean? Where is it coming from? But against that, we get all of the intrigue, the politics, the tension of a world where now there are only 2 great empires, the technology and military might of the Nazi Reich outstripping the Japanese Empire. It is inevitable that there will be conflict. Hitler, still alive, loves the Japanese, has a close relationship with Japan, but there are those that are looking forward to removing him and moving against Japan, or waiting for his death and moving against Japan. And so we get this world that is very much racked with all these imperfections and is meant to be dystopian and nightmarish from our perspective, and yet it could be a lot worse. And the efforts of people in the Reich and people without any real clear-cut heroes, because even the resistance fighters are dirty and do dirty things in desperation for their cause, which is realistic. But against the backdrop of these conflicts, these characters, what they go through, what they suffer, we see how this plot unfolds. By the time we get to partway through season 2, you immediately notice that it is moving in a direction that we will eventually call woke. It starts to do things that are not done in the novel in a way that the novel would not have done. They had omitted references to the Christian Bible from the series, although it is referenced in the book. Finally, at season 2, we get a clergyman who was defrocked, who lives in the Pacific States, because the Japanese made it illegal, who's very critical, of course, of his own religion and dismissive of having been a Christian, and makes a wildly ridiculous statement about the conspiracy that created the King James Bible. I don't even know what website they Googled that on. Going out of their way to make the resistance more diverse, bringing in a Japanese-American resistance fighter who, of course, was a victim of American relocation to a Japanese internment camp. The whole thing seems really rather weird and forced. America, having lost World War II and being dominated from the 40s on by foreign powers, is not likely to produce resistance movements that look like they came about in the 1990s. It really forced It gives them a forced diversity and inclusion. It gives them the ability to whine and complain about American crimes because they realize, in this Axis-dominated universe, we can't really rip on Americans like we ought to be properly woke. And so it begins to go kind of haywire there. Season 3 is the beginning of it. Just becomes garbage. They add more and more original storylines. They twist and mutate. The character of Ed suddenly becomes a homosexual. That has to be done. There's a whole black communist uprising movement, which again had to form because, America always sucked anyway, and now they have to fight the Japanese. And the likelihood that these folks would be alive, exist as a thing, and be able to organize like that after all those years of it just completely, again, it's completely forced and contrived in order to have people of color that are heroic, and they're always heroic, and they don't want no help from the white people, and they won't coordinate eventually with the resistance, and they're the ones that lead this great uprising, and it ends up being pro-communist, pro-critical race theory. It really just ends up being garbage by the end. And Obergruppenführer Smith, who rises through the ranks, becomes an Oberstgruppenführer. Eventually, in the later seasons, he becomes the Führer of the American Reich. It becomes essentially autonomous from the European Reich. Happens rather suddenly. But you know what they do? They destroy his entire redemption arc. At some point, they realized, wait a minute, this guy's a Nazi. We can't have him be human. We can't let him fix anything. All along early seasons, if you follow this, you really can't wait for him to turn. What you really want is, that there's an American in there that has been forced to live under this system, and you're waiting for him to take steps to make it better. And you can see where he's working. He works for peace with the Japanese to prevent war. He's working to do positive things. And then, of course, when he's got power, you're like, okay, at least they're going to give us this. And they don't. And in the end, he's like, well, I just can't stop myself. I'm just going to be a genocidal maniac now. Suddenly, I'm just going to not be able to change course because I don't know how to do any different. And his own wife, the empowered woman rising up, causes his death in order to free everybody from it. And you spent all this time building this history and giving the complexity to this character and his arc, and we're waiting for him to be redeemed, but they realize you're not allowed to do that now. Because by the time it gets to that, we're in the era of woke, and people that have done these things can never, ever be forgiven. They have to be canceled forever. You can't possibly. And so each of the characters in turn is essentially the writing destroys the characters they created. By the time I got to the end, that last season, I skipped through a whole bunch of episodes and just watched the finale to see how it was done, because it was just garbage. But the first 2 seasons, and you could tell they weren't sure, maybe they weren't sure they were coming back for a third and a fourth, because the end of the second season gives us a nice, it's not like the wrap up to everybody's life story, but it brings all of those sort of outstanding immediate things to a close in a way that you feel like now what's going to happen, and it can remain a mystery. She gets her sister back, and well, you can watch it, but you're kind of left where Alexa Davalos gets back in touch with the man in the high castle. There's a little discussion about fate and about everything that's been happening. And it could wind up there. And boy, I wish it had. I wish it had not lived long enough to suck. Because there are some good things that happen in the third season. We do get more about John Smith and his character. We get more about but it's declining. And the fact that they pull the rug from under you and leave all these characters pretty unredeemed at the end, it really does not, it just doesn't work. The one thing I will say that does work is when they did close it down, the very final act, it had led into a science fiction-y concept of this machine the Nazis were building to travel to other worlds. And there's a quick, a rupture, and we end on this really vague, people are coming through from random universes, and it looks like the multiverse is collapsing perhaps into one. A lot of people felt like it was a weird way to end it, but the book ended in a very similar way, where she has met the man in the high castle, driving back to Japanese-held territory, but it's not clear whether she's going to arrive in that universe or our universe or a different one. There's a real mystery sort of left at the end, which is kind of what season 2 did, and it's kind of what they do finally come back to at the very end of the series, but not before butchering all of the good quality stuff that they built in the interim. But I really love going back and watching those first 2 seasons, but it's something to see these shows that are on that cusp where they were not allowed to continue to be good, and then the stuff made after is just not good from the beginning. But those first 2 seasons are wonderful stuff. I wish there was more quality version of it, but the novel is always there. It's a lot shorter and a much more limited story, so you gotta read the book, watch the first 2 seasons. If you can choke down the last 2 seasons, go ahead, be my guest, and let me know what you think below. The Man in the High Castle.